The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the Bennett Ranch living room. Outside, December snow blanketed the California valley in unusual white, a Christmas gift from a sky that rarely gave such things. William Bennett sat in his leather chair, 85 years, pressing down on shoulders that had carried more than their share of burden. His grandson, Bobby Samuel's only son, just 18, and fresh from basic training for a war in the Pacific, sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, eyes bright with the hunger young men have for stories of courage. "Grandpa," Bobby said, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of boyhood and emerging manhood. "They say you once faced down 5 armed men with nothing but a Winchester and your word. Is that true?" Will's weathered hands, still strong despite the decades, rested on the arms of his chair. He looked at those hands for a long moment, remembering when they had been younger, remembering the weight of that rifle, remembering the taste of fear mixed with determination. "Not quite how the story goes, son," Will said, his voice like gravel smoothed by rivers of time. "I didn't face them down. I just stood there with that Winchester and let them know I was serious about what I said. There's a difference. Facing down suggests I was looking for a fight. I wasn't. I was just drawing a line and daring them to cross it." Samuel Bennett, 54 years old, and the mirror image of his father in younger days, leaned against the doorframe. He had heard pieces of this story throughout his life, fragments offered during fence repairs or cattle drives, but never the full telling, never from beginning to end. "Tell Bobby about his grandmother, Father," Samuel said quietly. "Tell him the real story, from the start." Grace Miller, 74 now and still moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had learned young that survival meant action, appeared from the kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron flour, dusting her fingers like snow. On the wall behind her hung a photograph carefully preserved behind glass. A woman of 55 years looked out from that frame, her eyes carrying the weight of hard living, but also something else. Dignity, strength, the unbreakable core of someone who had learned to survive. Will closed his eyes for a moment. The sounds of the present faded. The crackling fire became the wind across open prairie. The comfort of his chair dissolved into the hard wooden seat of a wagon. And suddenly he was there again. 1885, 30 years old, broken, alone, standing in a crowd of people who were about to teach him what happened when civilized men forgot what civilization meant. "You want to know about your grandmother?" Will's voice dropped lower, entering that space where memory and storytelling merge. "Then listen close, because this isn't a story about romance or rescue. This is about the day I learned that some things are worth fighting for, even when you've got nothing left to lose. Especially then." Bobby leaned forward. Samuel moved into the room, settling into the chair beside his father. Grace pulled up a stool, her eyes already glistening with tears she knew would come. They all waited, and William Bennett, 85 years old and still carrying the choices of his youth like precious cargo, began to speak. The year was 1885. California's Central Valley lay parched under a sun that showed no mercy. 3 years of drought had turned what should have been golden wheat fields into expanses of brittle brown. Rivers that once ran strong enough to power mills now trickled like old men's tears, and men who had come west seeking fortune found themselves face to face with a harder truth. Sometimes the land takes more than it gives. Sometimes survival means making choices that strip away whatever honor you thought you possessed. Will Bennett, at 30 years old, was not the man who would one day sit in that chair by the fire. That Will was a ghost inhabiting a body that went through the motions of living without understanding why. 3 years earlier, fever had swept through the valley like a scythe through summer grass. It took the young, the healthy, the beloved. It took without pattern or mercy. In one terrible week, it took Will's wife Margaret, 26 years old and beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with how she saw the world. It took their son David, 3 years old, and just learning that words could express the enormous thoughts tumbling through his young mind. Will spent the year after their deaths trying to find the bottom of every bottle of whiskey between Riverside and Sacramento. He succeeded in losing time, losing money, losing the respect of neighbors who had once called him friend. What he did not succeed in doing was dying. His body, stubborn in its health, refused to let grief kill it. So eventually, when the whiskey ran out, and the money ran out, and the patience of those who had known Margaret ran out, Will did the only thing left to do. He went back to work. The Bennett Ranch sprawled across 200 acres of valley land, though calling it sprawling was generous. Only 50 of those acres saw cultivation. Wheat and barley struggled in soil that begged for rain. 15 head of cattle grazed on grass that grew thin and yellow. The ranch needed 50 head to break even, needed water that wasn't there, needed labor that one man couldn't provide alone. The barn roof leaked. Red rust ate at the corrugated tin like a slow cancer. Will had counted the damaged sections. 500 new shingles needed. At 2 cents per shingle, that meant $10 he didn't have. The windmill that pumped water from the deep well stood silent most days. The bearings had worn smooth metal, screaming against metal whenever he tried to turn it. Replacement bearings cost $40. $40 might as well have been $4,000. 2 miles of split rail fencing needed repair or replacement. Posts rotted where they met the earth. Rails sagged or snapped. Cattle wandered through gaps that Will patched with wire and prayers. And hanging over everything, pressing down on Will's shoulders like a physical weight, sat the debt. $300 owed to Riverside Bank, 8% interest per year. Payment due in 3 months. Miss that payment and the bank would foreclose. The land Margaret had loved, the home where David had taken his first steps, would belong to strangers. Will knew who those strangers would be. Silas Blackwood made sure everyone knew. 5 years earlier, Will and Silas had been partners, equal shares in a cattle operation that showed promise. Each man had invested $5,000 money that represented years of saving, of sacrifice, of believing that California offered opportunities for men willing to work. Silas handled the financial records. Will managed the operations. It seemed like a natural division of labor. Will was good with cattle, good with land, good with the practical matters of making things work. Numbers made his head ache, so he trusted his partner to handle that side of things. Trust, Will learned, was sometimes just another word for blind. In 1881, during a routine visit to the bank, Will noticed discrepancies. $5,000 had moved from the partnership account into an account bearing only Silas Blackwood's name. When Will confronted him, Silas had explanations ready. Temporary transfers, accounting errors, misunderstandings about how business was conducted. But Will had seen the dates, had seen the careful pattern of withdrawals, each small enough not to trigger immediate notice, but together adding up to exactly half their capital. He had seen the truth behind Silas's smooth words and sympathetic smile. He ended the partnership, demanded repayment, consulted a lawyer who looked at the paperwork and shook his head sadly. Without proof of intent, without witnesses to conversations, without anything but Will's certainty against Silas's denials, a court case would cost more than the stolen money and likely end in nothing. So Will walked away from $5,000 and a partnership. He walked away believing that at least the loss was behind him. He was wrong. Silas took that stolen money and built an empire of sorts. Land was cheap in drought years. Desperate men sold at desperate prices. Within 4 years, Silas Blackwood owned 10 ranches scattered across the valley. He had a system. He would pressure struggling ranchers, make their difficulties worse through subtle sabotage, then appear with cash offers that seemed generous to men drowning in debt. Will knew the system because he had seen it work on 3 of his neighbors. He knew his own ranch sat in Blackwood's sights, a missing piece in a contiguous block of land that would make Silas one of the largest landowners in the county. He knew, in other words, that the fight was coming. He just didn't know it would start with a woman standing on an auction block in the June heat, her bare feet on scorched wood, her chin lifted in defiance against a world that had decided she was worth less than livestock. The morning of June 12, 1885, Will woke before dawn as he always did. His routine had become mechanical. dress in the pre-dawn darkness, make coffee strong enough to strip paint, eat bread and whatever preserves remained from the previous summer, feed the horses, check the cattle, work until exhaustion made sleep possible. He had no intention of going into Riverside that day, but the barbed wire he needed for fence repair sat in the general store, 60 pounds of it, waiting for the $18 he had managed to scrape together. And Tom Morrison had expressed interest in buying 3 of Will's calves, cash money that could go toward those windmill bearings. So Will saddled his horse, a gray gelding named Ash, who had been Margaret's favorite, and rode the 15 miles into town. The summer sun climbed hot and white. Dust rose from Ash's hooves and hung in the still air. By the time Will reached Riverside's outskirts, sweat had soaked through his shirt and thirst had turned his mouth to cotton. He tied Ash to the rail outside the general store and was about to step inside when he heard the commotion from the town square. Voices raised, the distinctive cadence of an auctioneer's call, the murmur of a crowd large enough to fill the space between the courthouse and the stable. Auctions were common enough. Farm equipment, household goods, occasionally livestock when someone's fortunes had turned particularly bad. Will almost ignored it. His business was with wire and calves, not other people's misfortunes. But something in the tone of the crowd made him pause. There was a quality to the sound, a mix of fascination and discomfort that spoke of something unusual happening. Against his better judgment, Will walked toward the square. What he saw there would stay with him for the rest of his life, would become the moment that divided his existence into before and after, would be the choice that defined every day that followed. A wooden platform stood in the square's center, 3 feet high and 10 feet across. The same platform used for speeches during elections, for celebrations during harvest festivals. But today it served a different purpose. A woman stood on that platform, not young. 55 if Will had to guess, though. Hard living could age a person beyond their years. She wore a simple dress, faded from too many washings, mended in places where fabric had given way to time and use. Her feet were bare. Her hands, clasped in front of her, showed the calluses and scars of decades of labor. Her hair, more gray than brown, had been pulled back in a severe bun that somehow emphasized the sharp lines of her face. But it was her eyes that caught Will's attention. Dark eyes that looked out over the crowd with neither fear nor pleading. Eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by this final indignity. Eyes that blazed with a quiet fury that spoke of banked fires waiting for fuel. Beside her on the platform stood a younger man, maybe 28, who would not meet those eyes. Thomas Whitmore, Will learned later. The woman's nephew, the man who had brought his aunt to this place and put her up for sale. And in front of the platform stood Marcus Grayson, the auctioneer, holding his gavel like a judge about to pronounce sentence, which in a way he was. The crowd numbered perhaps 60 people. Some had come for the spectacle, some from genuine interest in acquiring cheap labor, some because they could not quite believe this was happening and needed to witness it to accept its reality. Will pushed through to the front, his height and build making space naturally. He positioned himself where he could see clearly, where he could hear every word, and what he heard made his blood run cold. "Eleanor Whitmore," Grayson announced, his voice carrying the practiced clarity of a man used to being heard over crowds. 55 years of age. Health verified by Dr. Collins. Strong back, experienced in all household tasks. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, gardening. Can read and write basic arithmetic. Family vouches she is docile in temperament, asks no questions, requires minimal food and maintenance. Guaranteed for a minimum of 5 years' service. Guaranteed, like a piece of equipment, like a wagon wheel or a plow blade. Bidding opens at $30, 2-month standard wages. Who will start? Will looked around the crowd, cataloging faces. Some he knew, some were strangers. Their reactions told him everything he needed to know about who they were beneath whatever masks of civilization they wore. Adelaide Foster, 58 years old and wife to the bank president, stood near the front. Her face showed open disgust. "Who would waste food on something that old?" she said loudly enough for those around her to hear. "She'll drop dead within a year. Poor investment." Marcus Reed, who owned the dry goods store and considered himself a shrewd businessman, shook his head. Can't see getting enough work to justify even $30, past her prime by decades. But others looked at Eleanor Whitmore with different eyes, calculating eyes that saw cheap labor and didn't particularly care about the humanity of the commodity being sold. 25 there called out John Henderson, who ran a boarding house and constantly complained about the cost of hired help. 28, countered Sarah Pine, owner of a laundry service. Will felt something building in his chest, not the hot rage of sudden anger, but something colder, something that had been frozen for 3 years and was now beginning to thaw. He remembered Margaret's voice, remembered her sitting at their kitchen table reading from a book of poetry she loved. The measure of a civilization, she had read, is how it treats those who have nothing to give in return. This was civilization's measure then, this crowd of respectable people buying and selling human beings under legal pretenses, calling it indentured servitude instead of slavery, as if the words made it different, as if Eleanor Whitmore's lack of melanin somehow made her bondage more palatable. 32 bid a rancher Will didn't recognize. 35, countered another voice. Will's hands clenched into fists. He had come to town for wire and calf sales. He had $300 in debt and 5 months to save a failing ranch. He had no business involving himself in this. No business taking on another mouth to feed another responsibility, another possible loss. But he also had 3 years of being dead inside. 3 years of existing without purpose beyond mere survival. 3 years of Margaret's absence creating a void that nothing could fill. And standing before him was a woman who deserved better than this. Who deserved at minimum the dignity of being treated like a human being rather than livestock. Will stepped forward. The crowd noise seemed to dim, though that might have been his imagination. Or perhaps people sensed something coming, some disruption to their entertainment. "Grayson!" Will said, his voice cutting through the auction chatter like a blade through silk. "Before you continue, I have a question." Marcus Grayson frowned, recognizing Will, but also recognizing potential interference. "Bennett, this is a legal proceeding. Unless you're bidding, I'll ask you to remain quiet." "My question's simple," Will continued, ignoring the request for silence. He raised his voice, making sure the entire crowd could hear. "What did her family receive for bringing her here?" The square went silent. It was one thing to participate in an auction, to bid on labor, to engage in the legal fiction that this was somehow different from human trafficking. It was quite another to have someone point directly at the money-changing hands to force everyone to see the transaction for exactly what it was. Thomas Whitmore's face went pale. He opened his mouth closed. It looked everywhere except at his aunt. "I said," Will repeated, his voice harder now. "What did they get?" "Eleanor." Whitmore's voice rang out clear and steady. She had not spoken until now, had stood silent as others discussed her worth and value, but now she lifted her chin and looked directly at Will. "1 50-pound bag of flour," she said, "so my family wouldn't starve this winter." The crowd stirred. Murmurs rippled through the assembled people. Even those who had been comfortable with the auction found themselves uncomfortable with that specific number. A woman's life, her labor, her remaining years, traded for 50 pounds of flour. The math was too stark, the inequality too obvious. Will felt that cold thing in his chest expand. It filled him, this certainty of what needed to happen next. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. Heavy, full of every dollar he had managed to save over the past 6 months. Money meant for supplies, for repairs, for keeping the ranch alive. He walked to the auctioneer's table and upended the pouch. Silver dollars spilled across the wood. Quarters. Dimes. They clinked and rolled and caught the sunlight. "Count it," Will said to Grayson. "Should be $42.50. Grayson stared at the money, then at Will. "That's more than 3 months' wages for most men." "More than enough," Will agreed, "to cover whatever debt you claim she owes. But understand something, all of you." He turned to face the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "I'm not buying her. I'm not purchasing a human being like I'd buy a horse or a plow. What I'm doing is offering her a job, $20 per month plus room and board. She works for me. I pay her fair wages. She can quit any time she wants with 1 week's notice. She'll have her own room with a lock on the inside. She'll eat at the same table I do. And anyone who has a problem with how I choose to run my ranch can take it up with me, directly." He let his eyes rest on Silas Blackwood, who stood at the crowd's edge watching this unfold with an expression that mixed amusement with calculation. "Directly with me," Will repeated. Adelaide Foster sputtered. "You're mad, Bennett. That woman's half dead already. You're wasting your money and making a fool of yourself." But Dorothy Chin, owner of the general store and one of the few people in town Will still respected, stepped forward. "I think Mr. Bennett is doing exactly what he should, what all of us should have done from the start." Pastor James Miller, who had stood silent during the entire auction, finally found his voice. Leviticus provides specific guidelines for how indentured servants must be treated, with dignity, with respect. Perhaps Mr. Bennett is simply following Scripture where we have failed to do so. Thomas Whitmore tried to salvage some dignity. Aunt Eleanor agreed to this arrangement. We gave her a choice. Eleanor's laugh was bitter as alkaline water. "I agreed because the alternative was watching my sister's children starve. Don't pretend you gave me a real choice, Thomas. Don't make yourself the hero of this story." Will turned to face Eleanor directly. He looked up at her standing on that platform, meeting her eyes without flinching, without pity, without anything except honest recognition of what he saw there. "I'm William Bennett," he said. "I have a ranch 15 miles south of here, 200 acres. I need help with the land, the house, the livestock. I'll pay you $20 a month real wages deposited in an account with your name on it. You can leave any time with 1 week's notice. You'll have your own room, your own key. We'll eat together because I'm tired of eating alone and I figure you might be too, but I won't buy you like cattle. The decision is yours." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Those dark eyes seemed to look past his face, past his words, down into whatever core of him made choices and held convictions. Will had the distinct impression of being measured against some internal standard, being weighed and found either sufficient or wanting. "Why?" Eleanor asked. One word, but it carried the weight of every betrayal she had experienced, every disappointment, every moment of being invisible or treated as less than human. "Because everyone else looks at you and sees too old," Will said simply. "I look at you and see a survivor, and my ranch needs someone strong enough to help keep it from dying. That's the truth of it." Eleanor looked at his extended hand, calloused, scarred from work and accidents and the general wear of physical labor, steady, not trembling with nervousness or uncertainty, just there, offered without conditions or hidden prices. She reached out and placed her weathered hand in his. "I accept," she said. The crowd erupted in noise. Some people applauded, some muttered disapprovingly, some simply turned and walked away, unwilling to witness whatever came next. Silas Blackwood approached as Will helped Eleanor down from the platform. His smile was friendly, his voice pitched low enough that only Will could hear. "Quite the performance, Bennett. Very noble, very righteous. But you still owe the bank $300. You've got 5 months. This ranch of yours will be mine before winter, and your new employee along with it." Will met Blackwood's gaze without blinking. "You'll never have my ranch, and you'll sure as hell never touch her." Blackwood's smile widened. "We'll see." He walked away, his boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk, leaving Will standing with Eleanor Whitmore, the weight of his choice settling onto his shoulders like a yoke. Eleanor spoke quietly. "You just made an enemy." "I made that enemy 5 years ago," Will said. "This just made it official." They walked to where Ash stood, tied patient in the heat. Will helped Eleanor into the wagon he kept at the livery, paid the stable hand, and began the 15-mile journey back to the ranch. For the first 5 miles, neither spoke. Will focused on the road, on the rhythm of Ash's hooves, on the heat pressing down from a cloudless sky. But he was acutely aware of the woman beside him, not in any romantic sense. Will's heart had been buried with Margaret, and he had no illusions about that changing. But he was aware of her presence the way he might be aware of a new partner, someone with whom he would need to establish boundaries and understandings. Eleanor sat with her spine straight, never slumping despite obvious fatigue. Her hands rested in her lap but remained ready, prepared to brace against the wagon's movement. Her eyes scanned the horizon constantly, checking for threats or landmarks, or simply taking in the land she would now call home. Will broke the silence. "Some rules I want clear from the start," he said. "I'm listening." "First, you don't call me sir or master or anything like that. Will works fine. Second, you'll have your own room with a lock on the inside. I won't enter unless you invite me. Third, we eat together. I make breakfast, you make dinner, we share lunch. Fourth, payment is $20 on the first of each month. Fifth, if you want to leave, you tell me a week ahead. I'll drive you anywhere you want to go and give you 2 months' wages to start fresh." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "What do you want in return?" "Honest work, honesty in general, and help keeping that place alive. That's all. No other expectations." Will understood what she was asking without her having to spell it out. "No," he said firmly. "None. You're an employee. That's the sum total of our arrangement." Another silence. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of a story that needed telling. "My husband Robert died 2 years ago. His heart gave out after 30 years of hard work that barely kept us fed. We raised Thomas after his parents died in a wagon accident. 15 years I treated that boy like my own son. When Robert passed, I thought family meant something. I was wrong. Thomas's wife Martha convinced him I was a burden they couldn't afford. The drought made everything worse, so they made their choice. Thomas is a coward," Will said flatly. "You deserved better." "And you?" Eleanor asked. "What's your story?" Will kept his eyes on the road. Telling it never got easier, but Eleanor deserved to know who she was working for, what ghosts haunted the house she would call home. "Lost my wife Margaret and my son David 3 years back. Fever took them in 1 week. I spent the next year trying to drink myself to death. Failed at that. So I've spent the last 2 years trying to make the ranch work again. Succeeding slowly. But it needs more than one person can give." "You still grieve," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "Every day. But grief doesn't pay bills. And I've learned the dead stay dead, no matter how much you wish otherwise." They crested a rise, and the Bennett Ranch spread out before them. Will watched Eleanor's face as she took in her new home. He tried to see it through her eyes. The house 2 stories solid but in need of paint. The barn with its rusted roof. The windmill standing silent against the sky. The fences needing repair. The fields struggling in drought-stricken soil. 200 acres total, Will said, falling into the practical recitation that felt safer than emotions. 50 under cultivation wheat and barley. 15 cattle when we should have 50. Windmill needs new bearings, $40 I don't have. Barn roof needs 500 shingles, $10 I don't have. 2 miles of fence need rebuilding, and I owe the bank $300 due in 5 months. Miss that payment and they foreclose." "And Blackwood buys the note," Eleanor said. Will glanced at her surprised. "You know him?" "I know the type. Men who see other people's struggles as opportunities, vultures waiting for death." They pulled up to the house. Will helped Eleanor down from the wagon, led her inside. The interior was clean but sparse. Will had packed away Margaret's things 2 years ago, unable to bear seeing them daily, but unable to discard them. What remained was functional: a kitchen with a wood stove, a parlor with 2 chairs, upstairs 2 bedrooms. One had been his and Margaret's, the other had been David's. "That room is yours," Will said, gesturing to David's old room. "I cleaned it out last year. There's a bed, a dresser, a window that faces east. Locks on the inside of the door." Eleanor looked at the room, then back at Will. "You're giving me your son's room. I'm giving you a room that's not being used. That's all." But they both knew it was more than that. It was trust. It was an offering. It was Will's way of saying that the past, however painful, couldn't be allowed to stop the present from happening. The first week established patterns that would define their partnership. Eleanor woke at 4:30 every morning, a lifetime of habit impossible to break. The first morning, Will came downstairs to find coffee already made, biscuits in the oven, and Eleanor sweeping the kitchen floor. "You don't have to wake this early," he said. "Old habits," Eleanor replied. "And I want to." They fell into a rhythm. Work defined their days: fence repair, checking cattle, maintaining equipment that constantly threatened to fail. Eleanor proved stronger than Will had anticipated. When he handed her a fence post weighing 50 pounds and warned her to be careful, she picked up 2 of them, balanced one on each shoulder, and carried them 30 yards without breaking stride. "You'll hurt yourself," Will said, part concern and part shock. "I've carried heavier. Toilet bags at 80 pounds. Wheat sacks at 100. 50 pounds is nothing." Will felt anger rise in him, but not at Eleanor. At the life that had demanded such strength from her. At a nephew who had worked his aunt like a draft horse and then sold her when she could no longer be exploited. "Thomas worked you like an animal." Will said, his voice tight. Eleanor shrugged. "At least now I'm getting paid for it." That was when Will realized the truth. He hadn't rescued a damsel in distress. He had partnered with a warrior, someone who had survived 55 years, not through luck or charm or being protected, but through sheer will and strength. It changed something in how he saw their arrangement. This wasn't charity. This was partnership. Evenings they spent in comfortable silence. Dinner at 7, simple food, but more of it than Eleanor had seen in years. Afterward, Will would work on ranch accounts while Eleanor mended clothes or prepared food for the next day. Around 9, they would step out onto the porch, sit in chairs that faced the darkening valley, and watch stars emerge like memories from the void. They didn't talk much during those hours. They didn't need to. Both of them had learned that silence could be its own form of connection. 2 people who had lost too much sitting together in the dark, finding comfort not in words, but in presence. On the 7th day, Dorothy Chen visited. She brought a basket of food and a carefully neutral expression that didn't quite hide her concern. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said when she managed to get Eleanor alone, "are you safe here? You can tell me honestly." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile Dorothy had seen on her face in years. "Safer than I've been in decades. William Bennett is the most decent man I've met in longer than I can remember." "The town's talking," Dorothy warned. "Adelaide Foster is spreading rumors about the 2 of you, about impropriety." "Let her talk," Eleanor said. "For the first time in 55 years, I'm being treated like a human being. I don't much care what Adelaide Foster thinks about it." But not everyone in town thought poorly of the arrangement. Pastor Miller came by at the end of that first week, his face showing the shame of someone who had failed to act and now sought to make amends. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I wanted to apologize for my silence during the auction, for not speaking up when I should have. You did what I should have done." Will accepted the apology with a nod. He understood that courage came easier to some than others, and that sometimes good people made bad choices out of fear or uncertainty. What Will didn't see were the 2 riders watching from a distant hill. They sat on horses trained for silence, scanning the ranch through the afternoon heat haze. They watched Will and Eleanor work side by side on the southern fence line, watched the easy cooperation between them, watched and reported back to the man who paid them to watch. Silas Blackwood received their report in his office, a room decorated with maps showing property he owned and property he intended to own. Bennett Ranch sat in the middle of those maps, surrounded by Blackwood's acquisitions, like an island in an expanding sea. "They're working together," Blackwood asked, "like partner's boss. She's not afraid of him. He treats her like an equal." Blackwood drummed his fingers on the desk. "Interesting. Bennett always did have inconvenient principles. Very well. Let's begin to test how far those principles extend, how much he's willing to lose for them." 2 weeks after the auction, Will and Eleanor rode into town for supplies. They needed barbed wire for the southern fence feed for the horses, flour and salt, and coffee for the house. It was a routine trip, the kind they would make weekly. Neither expected it to become anything else. But Silas Blackwood had a talent for appearing where he would cause the most disruption. He stood outside the general store impeccably dressed, despite the heat, his smile friendly and his eyes cold. When Will and Eleanor approached, he stepped forward as if greeting old friends. "Bennett," he said warmly, "and Mrs. Whitmore, I've heard so much about you." Eleanor's voice could have frozen water. "I doubt very much it was anything good." Blackwood laughed. "Direct. I like that. Bennett, I wanted to extend my offer again. $500 for your ranch. Cash money, immediate transfer." "No," Will said. "Be practical. You owe $300 in less than 5 months. You just spent $42 on labor. The math doesn't work in your favor." "My math is fine." Blackwood's expression shifted, showing just a glimpse of something uglier beneath the civilized veneer. "Remember 5 years ago, Bennett? You were self-righteous then, too. Accused me of theft without proof. Cost us both a profitable partnership. You stole $5,000, Will said, his voice flat and hard. "I had the bank records showing the transfers. Records you interpreted incorrectly, but that's in the past. I'm offering help now. That's all. Your kind of help I don't need." Blackwood's smile returned, but it carried an edge now. "Ranching is unpredictable work. Fires happen, livestock gets sick, accidents occur, especially when a man gets distracted by new obligations. I'd hate to see something unfortunate happen." Eleanor stepped between them, her voice cutting. "Mr. Blackwood, California law is quite clear about arson and terroristic threats. You just made one in front of 6 witnesses. I suggest you be more careful with your words." Blackwood looked at her with new respect mixed with irritation. "Smart. Old, but smart." Will moved forward, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Not threatening, just present. 7 seconds to leave. 1. Blackwood held up his hands in mock surrender and walked away, his laughter trailing behind him like smoke. Dorothy, who had witnessed the exchange from the store entrance, approached. "You need to be careful. Blackwood's dangerous when he doesn't get his way." "I know," Will said. "We need a plan," Eleanor added quietly. On the ride home they discussed strategy. Will explained what he knew about Blackwood's methods: sabotage, subtle destruction, making problems appear natural until a rancher gave up and sold. Eleanor listened, asking questions, thinking through possibilities. "We need to document everything," she said. "Every incident. Build a case for when we go to the law." "And we need allies," Will agreed. "People willing to testify if it comes to that." They crested the final rise before home. Below them, the Bennett ranch should have looked peaceful in the late afternoon light. Instead, something was wrong. Will saw it immediately. The main gate stood open when it should be closed. He counted cattle. 12 visible when there should be 15. They rode faster, reached the gate and found it hadn't blown open. Someone had unlatched it deliberately. Boot prints in the dust prints that didn't match Will's boots or Eleanor's shoes. And carved into the barn door with a knife crude letter 6 inches high was a message, 3 months. Eleanor stood looking at those words, her face composed, but her eyes blazing. "It begins." Will stared at the carved threat, feeling that cold certainty solidify into something harder. This wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore. This was about protecting Eleanor, about proving that some lines once drawn were worth defending, no matter the cost. He thought about Margaret, about how he had failed to protect her from a fever that took no prisoners. He thought about David, about helplessness in the face of death. He thought about 3 years of being dead inside, of going through motions without purpose. And he thought about the woman standing beside him now, a survivor who deserved better than to be caught in someone else's war, but who would be caught anyway because Blackwood saw people as tools or obstacles, nothing more. "We need to find those 3 cattle," Will said, forcing practicality into his voice. "They couldn't have gone far." "And we need to report this to the sheriff," Eleanor added. "Start that documentation." They worked until dark, finding 2 of the missing cattle grazing in a ravine half a mile from the house. The 3rd remained missing. Will knew they wouldn't find it. Blackwood's men would have driven it far enough that recovery became impossible, making the theft look like simple wandering rather than deliberate theft. That night, sitting on the porch after a dinner, neither had much appetite, for Eleanor broke the silence. "You could still sell," she said quietly. "Take Blackwood's offer. Start somewhere else." Will shook his head. "This land was Margaret's dream. Mine too, once. I won't let a man like Blackwood take it through threats and sabotage." "Then we fight." "We fight," Will agreed. Above them stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human struggles, indifferent to choices made by desperate people in desperate times. The night wind carried the scent of dust and dying grass, the smell of a land waiting for rain that might never come. But inside the house a lamp burned in each bedroom window. Two people who had been alone too long now found themselves not alone. Found themselves against all odds and logic beginning to build something that looked almost like hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Blackwood would escalate. The bank would demand payment. The ranch would continue its slow struggle toward survival or failure. But tonight, two survivors sat together in the darkness, neither speaking, both understanding that sometimes the simple act of refusing to be alone was itself a form of courage. Sometimes just sitting together while the stars turned overhead was enough. Spring came reluctantly to the California Valley in 1885, as if the land itself had forgotten how to wake from winter's grip. The drought continued its stranglehold, but small mercies appeared. Morning dew collected in sufficient quantity to give the barley hope. 3 calves were born healthy. The fence line held against cattle that tested it with the persistence of creatures who knew weakness when they saw it. And in the Bennett ranch house, something else grew. Not romance, Will's internal voice reminded the old man telling this story 55 years later. Not yet. But partnership, trust. The careful building of something that might, with time and luck and survival, become more. March brought planting season. Will and Eleanor worked dawn to dusk turning soil that fought against cultivation, planting seeds that might or might not have the water they needed to germinate. The work was brutal, the kind that left muscles screaming and hands blistered even through work gloves. But it was also meditative, repetitive motion, the satisfaction of rows stretching behind you, progress made visible. Will found himself watching Eleanor when she wasn't aware of his observation. Not in any improper way, but with the assessment of someone discovering that an assumption was wrong. He had thought in some buried part of his thinking that hiring Eleanor would mean having help with household tasks. Cooking, cleaning, the domestic labor that Margaret had managed with such efficiency that Will hadn't fully appreciated it until she was gone. Instead, Eleanor worked beside him in the fields. She handled the plow with competence that spoke of years doing exactly this labor. When Will began to explain crop rotation, she finished his sentences, adding details he had forgotten. She knew soil quality by feel could predict rain by watching clouds, understood the relationship between moon phases and planting times. "Robert and I had 40 acres before he died," Eleanor explained one afternoon as they rested in the shade of a cottonwood by the creek. "Wheat mostly, some corn. I did as much of the field work as he did. Thomas took that land when Robert passed, added it to his own holdings. I got a bedroom in his house and 3 meals if I worked for them." "That's theft," Will said flatly. "That's family," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the bitter weight of betrayal. They fell into patterns. Will made coffee and breakfast before dawn. Strong coffee burned biscuits, eggs fried in bacon grease until they were more leather than food. Eleanor never complained, but on the 3rd morning she gently moved him aside and took over the eggs. They emerged fluffy, perfectly cooked, seasoned with herbs Will didn't know he had. "Watercress from the creek," she said when he asked. "And you had sage in the cupboard going stale. No sense wasting it." Lunch they shared in the fields, brief respites from labor. Bread and cheese, dried meat, water that tasted of iron from the well. They didn't talk much during these breaks. Words felt unnecessary when the work ahead spoke louder than conversation. Dinner became the day's centerpiece. Eleanor cooked meals that reminded Will of his mother's kitchen of times before loss had made eating a mechanical necessity rather than pleasure. Stews that simmered for hours, transforming tough cuts of meat into something tender. Bread that rose properly, crust golden and interior soft. Pies made from preserved fruit, the crusts flaky in ways Will's attempts never achieved. "You're wasting your talents on me," Will said one evening. "This is cooking for special occasions." "This is cooking for someone who appreciates it," Eleanor replied. "That's special enough." Evenings found them on the porch as spring twilight stretched longer each day. Will would work on ranch accounts. Eleanor would mend clothing or plan the next day's meals. Around 9 o'clock they would set aside their tasks and sit in the wooden chairs that faced the valley. Sometimes they talked. More often they simply existed together in the darkness. Will found himself sleeping better. Not well. Grief didn't release that easily. But better. The house felt less like a tomb and more like a place where living happened. He realized with some surprise that he had been holding his breath for 3 years. Eleanor's presence allowed him to exhale. For her part, Eleanor discovered space to be herself. Thomas and Martha's household had required her to be small, invisible, grateful for scraps. Here she could laugh when something was funny, could express opinions without fear of being told she spoke out of turn, could eat until full rather than leaving food for others who needed it more. One afternoon in early April they worked on the southern fence line, replacing posts that had rotted below ground level. The work required digging holes 3 feet deep, wrestling new posts into position, tamping dirt around them until they stood firm. Will handled the post hole digger, Eleanor managed the new posts. A section of fence sagged dangerously. Will examined it, decided it needed immediate attention before cattle discovered the weakness. He began digging, the post hole digger biting into hard earth. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the moderate temperature. He was aware of Eleanor watching, assessing his technique. "You're fighting the soil," she said after a few minutes. "Ground's hard as iron," Will replied, breathing heavily. "Which is why you pour water first. Softens it. Makes the digging easier." Will straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Robert teach you that?" "Life taught me that," Robert confirmed it. Eleanor fetched water from the barrel on the wagon, poured it into the hole Will had started. They waited 10 minutes, then Will resumed digging. The difference was remarkable. The digger sliced through softened earth with half the effort. "I've been ranching 15 years, Will said. "Never knew that trick." "You've been ranching alone," Eleanor corrected. "Different thing." They worked in silence for another hour. The sun climbed higher, heat pressed down, but the fence grew straight and strong, posts standing firm, rails level. Tangible progress. Physical proof that effort yielded results. As they prepared to move to the next section, Eleanor's foot slipped on loose rock. She stumbled, reaching for the fence rail to steady herself. Her hand closed on a section Will hadn't yet secured. It gave way. Eleanor fell backward hard. Will was beside her in seconds, helping her sit up. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor took inventory. Bruised pride. Maybe a bruised backside. Nothing broken. But Will saw her hand. She had gripped the rail tightly as she fell. Splinters had driven deep into her palm. Blood welled from 6 puncture wounds. "We need to clean that," Will said. His voice carried an urgency that surprised them both. "Infection in the hand can spread fast." They rode back to the house, Eleanor's hand wrapped in Will's bandana. In the kitchen, Will heated water, gathered clean cloth, retrieved the bottle of carbolic acid he kept for exactly these situations. He worked with surprising gentleness, cleaning each wound, extracting splinters with tweezers, finally wrapping her palm in clean bandage. "You've done this before," Eleanor observed. "Margaret was always hurting herself. Garden thorns, kitchen knives. I got practiced at patching her up." Will's voice caught slightly on his wife's name, as it always did. Eleanor studied his face. "You loved her very much." "Yes," Will said simply. "And David. Losing them nearly killed me. But it didn't. No, though there were days I wished it had." Eleanor placed her uninjured hand over Will's. The gesture was brief, just a moment of contact, but it carried weight. Understanding. The recognition of one survivor acknowledging another. "We survive," Eleanor said quietly. "Even when we don't want to. That's the curse and blessing of being built tough." In early May, Dorothy Chin visited with news. Tom Morrison sold his ranch to Blackwood, took the offer last week. Will felt cold settle in his stomach. Morrison's land bordered Bennett Ranch on the east side. Blackwood now controlled 3 sides of Will's property. He had a choice, Dorothy continued. His well dried up. Blackwood offered triple what the land was worth. Tom couldn't refuse. "And now Blackwood owns everything around me except the north border," Will said. "Which is government land," Eleanor added. "Blackwood can't buy that." "But he can buy everything else," Will said grimly. "He's building a box." That night a new strategy emerged. If Blackwood controlled access to town from 3 directions, Will would need to establish supply lines through the north. Harder terrain, but possible. They discussed options long into the night. For every move Blackwood might make, they planned countermoves. "He's patient," Will warned. "He'll squeeze slowly, make things difficult rather than impossible, force me to give up rather than fight." "Then we don't give up," Eleanor said. "Simple as that." But simple and easy were not the same thing. The attacks when they came were subtle. Fences cut overnight requiring hours to repair. A gate left open cattle wandering miles before Will found them. Feed supplies ruined by water that appeared to have leaked from the barn roof but had actually been poured deliberately. Each incident cost time, cost money, cost the emotional energy required to maintain hope in the face of systematic harassment. Will documented everything in a ledger he kept locked in his desk. Dates, damages, costs, building evidence for a legal case he wasn't sure would ever see a courtroom. Through it all, Eleanor remained steady. When Will's frustration boiled over, she absorbed it without taking it personally. When exhaustion made him snap at small things, she gave him space. And when the weight of it threatened to crush him, she sat beside him and said nothing, her presence alone enough to remind him he wasn't fighting alone. Late May brought a storm that changed everything. Rain had been absent for so long that when clouds gathered on the western horizon, both Will and Eleanor stopped work to watch. The clouds built through the afternoon towering structures that promised water the land desperately needed. The storm hit at dusk. Not the gentle spring rain that soaked deep, but a violent thunderstorm that hammered the earth with hail and wind. Will and Eleanor secured the barn, brought the horses inside, did what they could to protect equipment from the onslaught. Through the wind's howl, Will heard something else. Pounding. Desperate. Someone at the front door. He opened it to find a young woman collapsed on his porch, soaked through, shivering violently. She looked perhaps 19, thin to the point of gauntness, her dress torn in several places. Blood stained her sleeve. Her eyes held the blank terror of someone who had run until running was no longer possible. "Please," she gasped. "Please, he'll kill me if he finds me. Please." Will pulled her inside. Eleanor appeared immediately with blankets with warm water, with the practiced competence of someone who knew how to care for the desperate. "Who's after you?" Will asked, keeping his voice calm despite the anger building in him. "Silas Blackwood," the girl whispered. "My name is Grace Miller, Pastor Miller's daughter. I worked for Mr. Blackwood for 6 months. He said it was to work off my father's debt. But he wanted more than work. When I refused, he said I couldn't leave. Said if I tried, he'd have my father arrested for the debt. So I ran." Eleanor wrapped Grace in blankets, examined the injury on her arm. A deep cut, but clean. She cleaned it with carbolic acid while Grace hissed in pain, but didn't cry. "How much does your father owe?" Will asked. $200. Father borrowed it for church repairs after the fire last year. Can't pay it back with the drought hurting everyone's tithes." Will and Eleanor exchanged glances. $200 was exactly the kind of sum Blackwood used to trap people. Not so large they couldn't imagine paying it back. Not so small they could pay immediately. Just enough to create dependence. "You're not going back," Eleanor said firmly. "Whatever Blackwood thinks he owns, he doesn't own you." Grace looked between them, hope and fear warring in her expression. He has 5 other girls, all working his properties, all trapped the same way. Their families owe him money. He uses the debt to keep them. That's trafficking. Will said the word coming out hard and cold. Doesn't matter how he dresses it up legally, he's trafficking in human beings. Who would believe us? Grace asked. He owns the deputy, the sheriff's in Sacramento most of the time, and everyone's too afraid to speak against him. Will stood pacing the small kitchen. His mind worked through the problem like he would work through a mechanical issue. What were the pieces? What leverage existed? How could you move against someone who seemed to control all the mechanisms of power? We go to Sacramento, he said finally. Talk to the sheriff directly. Bring a newspaper reporter. Make it public enough that Blackwood can't bury it. That's 3 days' ride, Eleanor said. Round trip. Blackwood's men will know Grace is here within hours. They'll come for her. Then we prepare for that, Will replied. Grace, you're under my protection now. Eleanor's too. Anyone comes for you, they go through us. Grace began to cry tears of relief and exhaustion. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Eleanor pulled the girl close, maternal instincts awakening after decades of dormancy. Because someone helped me when I needed it, and because every woman deserves better than what men like Blackwood offer. They set Grace up in the small storage room off the kitchen made comfortable with blankets and pillows, fed her stew and bread until color returned to her face. And while Grace slept the sleep of the truly exhausted, Will and Eleanor planned. He'll come for her, Eleanor said. Probably tomorrow. I know. You're prepared to shoot men over this. Will met her eyes steadily. I'm prepared to defend what's mine, and anyone under my roof is under my protection. So yes, if it comes to that. Eleanor nodded slowly. Then we should be ready. Will taught both women to shoot that night after the storm had passed, and stars emerged in a scrubbed clean sky. He had 2 rifles, a Winchester repeater and an older Springfield. He showed them how to load, how to aim, how to manage recoil. Grace had never held a gun. Her hands shook, but Eleanor unsurprisingly had experience. Robert taught me, she said when Will complimented her grouping. Said a ranch woman needed to know how to defend herself when men were in the fields. They practiced until both women could hit a target at 30 yards with reasonable consistency, not expert marksmanship, but enough to make anyone attacking think twice. Remember, Will said as they finished, you don't draw a weapon unless you're willing to use it, and you don't use it unless there's no other choice. But if that choice comes, don't hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed. The riders came at dawn as Will had predicted, 5 men on horseback, dust rising behind them like smoke. Will watched them approach from the porch, his Winchester held casually but ready. Eleanor stood to his right with the Springfield. Grace, despite her fear, stood to his left with a loaded revolver Will had given her. The lead rider dismounted. Will recognized Jack Brennan, one of Blackwood's foremen, a hard man with a reputation for violence barely constrained by the veneer of civilization. Bennett, Brennan called. We're here for the girl, Mr. Blackwood's property. No need for trouble. Will's voice carried across the yard clear and hard. Grace Miller isn't property. She's a free woman who sought refuge. She's under my protection now. She's an indentured servant who ran from legal obligation, Brennan countered. We have papers, legal documents. Papers saying what? That Blackwood owns her because her father owes him money. Those aren't legal. They're slavery dressed up in nice words. Brennan's hand moved toward his holster. Will raised the Winchester fractionally. Eleanor and Grace followed suit. Before you do something stupid, Eleanor's voice rang out, consider this. California law is clear about threatening violence to collect debts. You came here with 5 armed men to take a woman against her will. That's assault, possibly kidnapping. We have witnesses. Touch anyone on this property and you'll hang for it. Brennan paused. His eyes flicked between the 3 people on the porch, calculating odds. 5 men against 3. But those 3 were positioned defensively, had cover, had clear fields of fire. And Brennan, whatever his flaws, wasn't stupid enough to start a gunfight. He might not win. Blackwood won't let this stand, Brennan said. Blackwood can take it up with me directly, Will replied. Not through hired thugs. This isn't over. Never thought it was. The riders left, taking their implicit threat with them. But all three people on the porch knew it was temporary reprieve, not permanent solution. We need to go to Sacramento today, Will said. Now, while they're regrouping. All three of us? Eleanor asked. No, you and Grace stay here. Hold the ranch. I ride alone. I'll be faster that way. Faster getting killed, Eleanor shot back. We go together or not at all. They stared at each other, wills clashing. Finally, Will nodded. Together then. We leave in 1 hour. Pack light. The ride to Sacramento took 12 hours at hard pace. They switched horses at a way station, halfway paid double to borrow fresh mounts. Reached the state capitol as dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. Sheriff Tom Anderson was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of dealing with human nature at its worst. He listened to their story without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each detail. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. I've heard rumors about Blackwood, he said. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. What you're describing is serious, but I need evidence. Grace's testimony, Will said. Her injuries. The other girls still trapped on his properties. One girl's word against a wealthy landowner. In court, that might not be enough. Then what do we do? Eleanor asked, frustration sharpening her voice. Anderson leaned forward. We build a case, document everything, find the other girls, get their testimony, show a pattern. Then I can move with legal authority. But I need time. We might not have time, Will said. Then make time. Protect Grace. Document any threats or attacks. I'll deputize 6 men and come to Riverside next week. We'll search Blackwood's properties, interview the girls. But we do this legal, by the book. Otherwise it falls apart in court. They left the sheriff's office with less satisfaction than Will had hoped for, but more than nothing. At least the authorities knew. At least someone with power was paying attention. James Walsh, a reporter for the Sacramento Union, proved more immediately helpful. He listened to their story with the hungry expression of someone who recognized front-page material. This is the story I've been waiting for, Walsh said, scribbling notes. Labor trafficking, intimidation, corruption. I'll run it tomorrow. Front page. With your permission, I'd like to interview Miss Miller. Grace agreed. The interview took 2 hours. Walsh carefully documenting dates, names, details that would build the narrative. When he finished, he shook their hands. Thank you, he said simply, for having the courage to speak up. You'd be surprised how rare that is. They stayed in Sacramento that night, finding a modest hotel that didn't ask questions about 3 people traveling together. Will paid for 2 rooms. He and Eleanor shared one, Grace took the other. Nothing improper occurred. They were too exhausted for anything except sleep. But in the darkness before dawn, Will lay awake, acutely aware of Eleanor sleeping in the other bed, aware of how much had changed in 6 weeks, how this woman who had been a stranger, who he had defended more from principle than personal feeling, had become someone he couldn't imagine losing. He thought about Margaret, about the guilt that came with moving forward, about whether it was betrayal to feel something for someone else. Eleanor's voice came soft through the darkness. You're thinking too loud. Sorry, didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. I'm thinking too. Pause. About what happens when we get back. Blackwood will escalate. I know. Are you ready for that? Will considered the question honestly. No, but I don't see an alternative. Eleanor sat up, her form just visible in the pre-dawn darkness. There's always an alternative. You could sell. Take the money. Start somewhere else. Somewhere Blackwood's reach doesn't extend. That land was Margaret's dream. Mine too once. I won't surrender it to a man like him. Then we fight. Together. Together. Will agreed. They arrived back at the ranch late afternoon the following day to find everything intact. No new attacks, no threats, just the peaceful valley and the ranch standing strong. But the peace was temporary. Will knew it. Eleanor knew it. They prepared as best they could. stockpiled ammunition, kept weapons close, took turns on watch at night. The newspaper article ran 3 days after their Sacramento trip. Walsh had done his job well. The story detailed Blackwood's labor trafficking. Named victims described the system of debt bondage. It ran on the front page with a headline that left no room for misinterpretation: Riverside rancher enslaves young women. The response was immediate and varied. Some people in Riverside expressed shock. Others defended Blackwood, saying the article exaggerated or misrepresented legitimate business practices. The town divided along lines of power and principle. Pastor Miller came to the ranch, shame written across his face. "I should have protected my daughter. Should have refused the loan or found another way. I'm sorry." "You're not the one who needs to apologize," Will said. "Blackwood is, and he will." But days passed with no legal action. The sheriff was building his case. Anderson sent word, gathering evidence, preparing for arrests that would stick in court. Be patient. Patience, Will discovered, was harder than he expected. June brought heat that pressed down like a physical weight. The drought continued its stranglehold. Crops struggled despite their best efforts. Cattle lost weight as grass turned brown and sparse. The ranch teetered on the edge of failure, held upright by Will's determination and Eleanor's refusal to surrender. And through it all, something grew between them. Not spoken, not acknowledged openly, but present like water beneath drought-dry soil. Will caught himself watching Eleanor work, admiring not her appearance, but her competence, the way she solved problems, the way she faced difficulties without complaint, the way she made the house feel alive. Eleanor caught herself thinking about Will in moments when practical concerns didn't dominate her thoughts. His quiet strength, his principled stands even when they cost him, his gentleness hidden beneath layers of grief and practical necessity. They didn't speak of these feelings. Both of them carried too much history, too much loss, too much fear of what acknowledging attraction might mean. Until the barn loft changed everything. Will was checking cattle in the south pasture when he heard Grace scream. He ran toward the sound, heart hammering, expecting to find Blackwood's men. Instead, he found Grace standing at the barn entrance, pointing upward, her face white with terror. Eleanor hung from a support beam in the barn loft, her fingers locked around wood slick with decades of accumulated grime. Below her, a 20-foot drop to the barn floor. She had been checking hay stores when old planking gave way beneath her feet. Only reflexes had saved her from falling completely. But her strength was failing. Her grip was slipping. Will moved without thought. He climbed the ladder to the loft, moved across stable planking to where Eleanor hung. Dropped to his stomach, reached down. His hands closed around her wrists. "I've got you," he said, trying to keep terror out of his voice. "Hold on." "My hands are slipping," Eleanor gasped. "Then hold my wrists. Lock your grip. I'll pull you up." Eleanor managed to shift her hold fingers, digging into Will's wrists with desperate strength. He pulled muscles, screaming back, straining. Inch by agonizing inch, he dragged her up until she could get one elbow onto the loft floor, then the other. Together they scrambled away from the hole, collapsing on solid planking, breathing hard. For a long moment neither spoke. They simply lay there, hearts hammering the nearness of death, slowly retreating. Then Will pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her with desperate intensity. "God," he whispered into her hair, "I thought I'd lost you. I can't lose you, Eleanor. I can't." When he pulled back, his hands were shaking. His eyes were raw with emotion he had been suppressing for weeks. "I need you to know," he said slowly, words coming with difficulty, because feeling things was one matter and speaking them was quite another. "You matter to me, more than I can explain properly, more than I know how to say. I can't go back to being alone, wouldn't survive it again." Eleanor stared at him, her own defenses cracking. "Will, you don't have to say anything," he added quickly, old fears surfacing. "I know life's been hard. I know I'm asking complicated things. I just needed you to know." But Eleanor didn't pull away. Instead, she placed her hand against his cheek. "You matter to me too, more than I thought possible at my age, more than I believed I could feel again." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to turn away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, almost questioning. Then it grew fiercer, years of loneliness and loss pouring into that contact. When they finally separated, both were crying. "I loved Margaret," Will said, needing to be honest. "I'll always love her. She gave me years of happiness and a son I'll never stop missing." "I know," Eleanor replied. "And I loved Robert. That doesn't diminish this. Love isn't a finite resource that runs out when you give it to one person. I'm 25 years younger than you. I'm aware of basic arithmetic. People will talk. Adelaide Foster will have a field day." Eleanor laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "Let her talk. I spent 55 years caring what people thought. I'm done with that." That evening, after Grace had gone to bed and the ranch had settled into night quiet, Will and Eleanor sat on the porch as they had dozens of times before, but this time Will reached for Eleanor's hand. She took it, fingers interlacing. "Marry me," Will said. Eleanor went still. "What?" "Marry me. I know it's fast. I know people will judge. But Eleanor, I love you. I love your strength, your courage, your refusal to be broken by a world that tried hard to break you. I loved my wife and son. I'll carry them in my heart always. But I love you too, and I don't want to waste time. We both know life's too short and too uncertain for that." "I'm 55 years old, Will." "I know. I'm weathered and worn and past any reasonable age for this. You're strong. You're brave. You're exactly who I need." He paused. "Exactly who I want." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I never thought anyone would want me. Not at this age. Not after everything." "Then you thought wrong." "Yes," she whispered. "God help me, yes. I'll marry you." They sat together under the stars, holding hands like young people courting, planning a future neither had dared imagine 6 weeks earlier. Neither noticed the riders watching from the distant hillside or the way Silas Blackwood smiled when his scouts reported back. The attack came 3 days later. Will and Eleanor had ridden to Sacramento to handle the marriage license, taking Grace with them for her safety. The round trip took 18 hours. When they crested the final rise before home, smoke rose black against the afternoon sky. The barn was burning. Not fully engulfed yet, but flames ate at the southern wall, spreading fast in the drought-dry wood. Worse, 5 riders circled the property, effectively trapping anyone who might be fighting the fire. But they weren't alone. Dorothy Chen stood with a bucket brigade of townspeople passing water from the well to throw on the flames. Pastor Miller worked the pump. 3 ranchers Will knew by sight fought to contain the fire's spread. The riders scattered when they saw Will approaching. No direct confrontation, just enough presence to send a message. By the time Will reached the barn, the townspeople had contained the worst of it. One wall was destroyed, hay stores ruined, equipment damaged, but the structure stood. Dorothy approached, soot staining her face. "We saw the smoke from town, came as fast as we could." "Thank you." Will said the words inadequate for the gratitude he felt. 20 people came, Dorothy continued. When they saw what was happening, they chose sides. Not everyone sided with Blackwood. Grace had been inside the house hiding as instructed if trouble came. She emerged now shaken but safe. Blackwood was here. He said to tell you this is what happens when you don't sell. He said worse is coming if you don't leave. Will surveyed the damage, hours of work to repair, money he didn't have to replace what was lost. But more than material loss, this was escalation. This was Blackwood moving from subtle harassment to overt destruction. Eleanor touched his arm. "We don't run." "I know, but this is going to get uglier. It already is ugly. We just acknowledge it now." That evening, as volunteers helped clear debris, Will made a decision. He would no longer wait for the law to move at its own pace. He would take the fight directly to Blackwood, not with violence, but with the one weapon more powerful than guns or threats: truth, made public and impossible to ignore. "Tomorrow," he told Eleanor, "we go back to Sacramento. We bring Sheriff Anderson here with deputies and warrants. We bring James Walsh with his notebook. We end this. Blackwood won't surrender easily. I don't expect easy. I expect hard. But I also expect to win." Eleanor smiled fierce and proud. "Then let's win." They stood together in the ruins of what Blackwood had tried to destroy, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with them, planning the fight that would determine not just the ranch's future, but whether principle could still triumph over power in a world that often seemed to reward cruelty more than courage. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns that had witnessed countless human struggles and would witness countless more. Indifferent to outcomes, simply there, eternal witnesses to the choices people made in moments of crisis. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, resolution, an ending to this chapter and the beginning of whatever came next. But tonight, Will and Eleanor had each other, had allies, had the stubborn refusal to surrender that marked true survivors. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. Dawn broke over the Bennett Ranch with the particular clarity that follows destruction. The burned barn wall stood like a monument to Blackwood's escalating war-blackened timber stark against morning sky. Will stood looking at it, coffee cup warming his hands, Eleanor beside him, in comfortable silence that had become their language. "Ready?" she asked. "No, but we're going anyway." They left within the hour. Grace stayed behind with Dorothy Chin, who had volunteered to remain at the ranch while Will and Eleanor rode to Sacramento. The journey felt different this time. Not desperate flight, but purposeful advance. They were no longer reacting to Blackwood's moves. They were making their own. Sheriff Anderson met them at his office with 6 deputized men, all hard-eyed veterans who understood that what came next might involve violence. James Walsh waited too, his notebook ready, his expression carrying the focused intensity of someone who knew he was witnessing history. "We ride today," Anderson said without preamble. "I've got warrants for Silas Blackwood, Jack Brennan, and 3 others. Charges include arson, intimidation, unlawful restraint, and human trafficking. We'll search all Blackwood properties, interview the women being held, gather evidence. Bennett, Mrs. Whitmore, you'll ride with us as witnesses." The convoy left Sacramento at mid-morning. 8 riders plus Will and Eleanor moving at steady pace toward Riverside. They reached town by late afternoon, the sight of a sheriff and deputies causing immediate stir. People gathered in doorways watching the procession with expressions ranging from satisfaction to concern. Blackwood's main ranch sprawled across 500 acres north of Riverside, the house a 2-story structure that spoke of wealth acquired quickly. Anderson didn't bother knocking. He kicked the door open, deputies flowing inside with weapons drawn. They found Blackwood in his office surrounded by ledgers and maps. He looked up without apparent concern, his smile easy. "Sheriff Anderson, what a surprise. I assume you have a warrant." Anderson slapped the paper on Blackwood's desk. 3 warrants. You're under arrest." "On what charges?" "Read them yourself." Blackwood scanned the document, his expression shifting from amusement to something harder. "This is absurd. Based on the word of one girl and a bitter former partner, no judge will convict on such flimsy evidence." "We'll see what the evidence shows," Anderson replied. Deputies searched the property, find the women. What they found turned Will's stomach. 5 young women ages 16 to 20 housed in a converted storage building behind the main house. The conditions were barely livable. Thin mattresses on bare floors, a single stove for cooking and heat, laundry tubs that doubled as baths. The women looked undernourished, exhausted, defeated, until they saw the sheriff. Then hope flickered in eyes that had forgotten what hope looked like. Anderson interviewed each woman separately. Their stories formed a pattern so clear, so damning, that even Blackwood's lawyer would struggle to explain it away. Debts ranging from $50 to $300. Families threatened with foreclosure or imprisonment if the women didn't work. No wages paid, only credit against debts that never seemed to decrease. Physical and sexual abuse for those who resisted. Grace identified 2 of the women as friends who had disappeared months earlier. Their families had been told they'd gone to work in San Francisco seeking better opportunities. Instead, they'd been trapped here, invisible to a community that chose not to see. James Walsh documented everything. His pencil flew across pages capturing details that would become tomorrow's front-page story, more than that evidence that would stand in court. "Mr. Blackwood," Walsh said as deputies led Silas out in handcuffs. "Do you have any statement for the record?" Blackwood's composure cracked. "This is Bennett's doing. He's been trying to destroy me for years. Ever since our partnership ended, this is revenge, nothing more." "The women tell a different story," Walsh replied calmly. "They're lying, all of them, ungrateful despite everything I've done for their families." Eleanor, who had been standing quietly observing, stepped forward. Her voice carried across the yard where townspeople had gathered to watch. "You made one mistake, Mr. Blackwood. You underestimated an old woman with nothing left to lose. You thought you could threaten and intimidate and destroy, and people would be too afraid to stop you. But you forgot something. The truly dangerous people aren't those who have everything. They're those who have nothing except their principles. And we just proved that principles backed by courage and evidence are stronger than your money and threats." For the first time, Silas Blackwood had no response. The ride back to Riverside became a procession. The 5 rescued women rode in a wagon driven by Dorothy Chen, who had come north when news spread. Townspeople lined the main street watching in silence as Blackwood was taken to the jail. Some looked ashamed. Some looked relieved. A few looked angry, their financial interests too tied to Blackwood's empire to allow satisfaction at his fall. Adelaide Foster stood outside her husband's bank, her face a study in conflicting emotions. As Eleanor passed, Adelaide called out, "Mrs. Whitmore, I was wrong about you, about Mr. Bennett, about all of this." Eleanor paused. "Yes, you were. I'm sorry, truly." Eleanor studied the older woman, seeing genuine regret beneath the pride. Sorry is a start. Doing better is what matters. Over the following days, Blackwood's empire unraveled. With him in jail awaiting trial, his properties became subject to legal seizure. The debts he claimed families owed proved under scrutiny to be inflated or entirely fabricated. Foreclosure notices he'd filed were revealed as based on loans made under duress. Pastor Miller's $200 debt record showed Blackwood had added fictitious interest charges that nearly doubled the amount owed. When this was revealed, the actual debt was determined to be $73. Pastor Miller paid it from the church's emergency fund and welcomed his daughter home with tears of gratitude. The trial, when it came 2 months later, lasted 3 days. 12 women testified. James Walsh's articles were entered as evidence. Will and Eleanor detailed the systematic harassment, the arson, the threats. The jury deliberated 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Silas Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in California State Prison. His properties were sold at auction, the proceeds distributed to his victims and creditors. The web of corruption he'd built over 5 years collapsed in a matter of weeks. Justice, Will reflected, was slower than he wished, but more thorough than he'd dared hope. But justice for Blackwood was only one chapter. The Bennett Ranch still faced its own crisis. The bank debt came due in September, $300. Will had managed to save $200 through careful management and the sale of cattle, but the gap remained. He was in town trying to negotiate an extension when Thomas Whitmore approached. Eleanor's nephew looked older than his 28 years, worn down by guilt and shame. "Mr. Bennett," Thomas began awkwardly, "could I speak with you?" Will's expression was cold. "Speak." "I want to apologize for what I did to Aunt Eleanor, for selling her like she was property. It was unforgivable." "Yes, it was. I brought this." Thomas held out a bank draft. $300. It's not enough to make up for what I did, but it's what I can offer to help with your debt." Will stared at the draft. $300 was exactly what he needed, but taking it from Thomas felt wrong, like accepting blood money. "Why?" Will asked bluntly. "Because I've spent 2 months watching you and Aunt Eleanor, watching how you treat her, how she's changed. She's happy, maybe for the first time since Uncle Robert died, and I realized I stole that from her. Stole years she could have spent living instead of just surviving. I can't give her those years back, but I can at least do this." Will looked at the younger man, seeing genuine remorse. He thought about Eleanor, about her capacity for forgiveness that exceeded his own, about how she had handled Thomas's appearance at Blackwood's trial with cold dignity, but not hatred. "I'll take the money," Will said finally, "but not as payment for what you did. That debt can't be paid. I'll take it as a loan, 5% interest. I'll pay you back over 2 years. That sound fair?" Thomas nodded, relief evident. "More than fair. And Thomas, if you want to make things right with Eleanor, you do it directly, not through me. I tried. She won't see me. Then you try harder, because she deserves to hear you apologize properly, face to face, not through intermediaries." Thomas agreed and left. Will stood holding the bank draft, feeling the weight of it. This money would save the ranch, would buy them time to recover from the losses Blackwood had inflicted, would give them breathing room to build something sustainable. He found Eleanor at the general store selecting fabric for new curtains. The house she'd declared needed updating, needed to reflect that it was a home again, not just a structure where people existed. "Thomas gave me money for the bank debt," Will said without preamble. Eleanor's hands stilled on the fabric. "Did he?" "Called it payment for what he did to you. I called it a loan. Told him he needs to apologize to you properly." "I don't want his apology." "Maybe not, but he needs to give it. And you need to decide whether you can forgive him." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. Then she sighed. "I'll see him. Once. What I do after that is my choice. That's all I'm asking." The meeting happened a week later at the ranch. Thomas arrived, nervous, hat literally in hands, looking like a man facing judgment. Eleanor received him on the porch, Will present, but silent. "Aunt Eleanor," Thomas began, then stopped, started again. "I don't know how to say this except plainly. I was wrong. What Martha and I did to you was cruel and unforgivable. I told myself we had no choice, that the drought made it necessary, that you'd be better off somewhere else. Those were lies. We had choices. I made the wrong one. And I'm sorrier than I can express." Eleanor studied her nephew with eyes that missed nothing. "Are you sorry for what you did? Or sorry you got caught doing it? Sorry people know what kind of man you are?" Thomas flinched. "Both. I won't lie. I'm ashamed people know. But mostly I'm ashamed of the man I became, the man who could sell his aunt for 50 pounds of flour. Where's Martha in all this?" "We separated. She went to live with her sister in Fresno. Couldn't face the town's judgment." "But you stayed." "I stayed. Because running from what I did won't change it. At least here I have to face it every day." Eleanor was quiet for so long that Will thought she might not speak. Then she stood, walked to the porch steps, looked out over the ranch that had become her home. "I won't forgive you, Thomas. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I won't carry hate either. It's too heavy a load. You want to make this right? Be a better man. Not to me. To whoever comes next in your life. Learn from this." "That's the only payment I'm interested in." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." "Yes, it is." He left, and Eleanor sagged against the porch rail. Will came to stand beside her, his presence offering support without words. "Did I do the right thing?" Eleanor asked quietly. "You did the Eleanor thing. That's always right." September turned to October. The ranch, freed from Blackwood's harassment and with debt paid, began to thrive. Will hired 2 ranch hands with money saved from not paying the bank. They repaired the burned barn wall, replaced damaged equipment, prepared for winter. Eleanor transformed the house. New curtains, fresh paint in the kitchen, flowers in vases, their brightness defying the ongoing drought. She made the place feel lived in rather than merely occupied. And through it all, Will found himself watching her with a mixture of affection and wonder. This woman who had been sold like livestock, who had every reason to be bitter and defeated, instead chose joy, chose to build, chose to believe in possibility. One evening in early August, as summer's heat began to ease and crickets sang their evening songs, Eleanor led Will to the porch after dinner. She'd been quiet all day, thoughtful in a way that suggested something weighing on her mind. "Will," she said as they settled into their chairs, "I need to tell you something." Concern flickered through him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, at least I don't think so. But I saw Dr. Collins yesterday while you were checking the south fence." Will's heart clenched. "Are you ill?" "No." Eleanor took his hand. "Will, I'm pregnant?" For 10 full seconds Will couldn't process the words. They sat in his mind like objects he couldn't quite grasp, too impossible to accept. "Pregnant?" he repeated numbly. "The doctor confirmed it. I'm about 8 weeks along." "But you're 55 years old." "I'm aware. Dr. Collins says it's rare but not impossible. He's documented 3 cases in his 20-year career. The oldest woman was 57. Will stood, paced to the porch rail, turned back. His face cycled through shock, joy, and fear in rapid succession. "A baby," he whispered. "We're having a baby." "Yes." He crossed to her, knelt beside her chair, placed his hand on her stomach with reverence. "After David, I never thought I'd have another child. Never dared hope. I never thought I'd have any child. Robert and I tried for years. Nothing came of it. I assumed I couldn't." Eleanor's voice trembled. "I'm terrified, Will. At my age, the risks are enormous. What did Dr. Collins say? That this is high risk, very high risk. Miscarriage is possible. Complications during birth are likely. I might not survive it." Fear clutched Will's chest. "Then we'll do whatever necessary to keep you safe. The baby matters too. You matter more." Eleanor placed her hand over his. "Let's not borrow trouble. Dr. Collins will monitor me carefully. We'll take precautions, and we'll hope for the best." Will pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "I can't lose you. After Margaret, after David, I can't survive losing you too. Then we'll fight for this, together, like we've fought for everything else." The pregnancy became the ranch's worst-kept secret. Dorothy Chin noticed immediately, her experienced eye catching the changes before Eleanor's condition became obvious. Pastor Miller offered prayers. Even Adelaide Foster, perhaps seeking redemption, brought herbal teas she claimed would help with morning sickness. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people expressed genuine joy. Others whispered about impropriety, about the unnaturalness of a woman Eleanor's age bearing children. Eleanor ignored them with the same magnificent disdain she'd shown for criticism throughout her life. "Let them talk," she told Will when he expressed anger at overheard comments. "They talked when you defended me at the auction, when we got married, when we fought Blackwood. Their talking hasn't stopped us yet." The pregnancy progressed through fall into winter. Eleanor experienced morning sickness that lasted well into afternoon fatigue, that made even simple tasks exhausting, and aches that came from a body not designed for this particular challenge at this particular age. But she also experienced joy. The first flutter of movement inside her at 16 weeks brought tears. Feeling the baby kick at 20 weeks made her laugh with delight. Watching her stomach swell with visible proof of life growing made both her and Will marvel at the miracle of it. Dr. Collins monitored her carefully. Weekly visits became the routine. He measured, listened, assessed. His expression remained cautiously optimistic, though Will saw worry in the doctor's eyes. "Any woman over 40 faces increased risks," Collins explained during one visit. "At 55, those risks multiply, but Eleanor is healthy, strong. She has better odds than most women her age would." "But still poor odds," Will said. "I won't lie to you, this is dangerous. We'll need to be ready for complications during birth. I'm arranging for a midwife who specializes in difficult deliveries, and I'm clearing my schedule for the expected due date." January brought snow to the valley, unusual weather that transformed the landscape into something from a dream. Eleanor, now 7 months pregnant and moving with careful deliberation, stood at the window watching flakes fall. "Samuel," she said suddenly. Will looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing. "What?" "If it's a boy, we should name him Samuel. After your father. Will felt emotion tighten his throat. His father Samuel had died 10 years earlier, a good man who had taught Will everything about ranching and integrity. Naming his son after his father would honor both past and future. And if it's a girl, he asked. Margaret, after your first wife. Will crossed to Eleanor, turned her to face him. You'd do that? Name our daughter after Margaret. She was your love, gave you years of happiness and a son. That deserves honoring. I'm not competing with her memory, Will. I'm grateful for what she gave you. Without her, you wouldn't be the man I love. He kissed her then gently because of her condition, but with all the love he couldn't adequately express in words. February brought the first real crisis. Eleanor woke at 3 in the morning with sharp pain and bleeding. Will rode through darkness to fetch Dr. Collins, pushing his horse to dangerous speeds over snow-slicked roads. Collins examined Eleanor, his face grim. The bleeding stopped. That's good. But she needs complete bed rest. No work, no stress, for the next month at minimum. I can't just lie in bed, Eleanor protested. You can and you will, Collins said firmly, or you'll lose this baby and possibly your life. For 2 weeks, Eleanor stayed in bed, going slowly mad with enforced inactivity. Will brought her meals read to her in the evenings, tried to keep her entertained. Grace, who had stayed with them as adopted daughter in everything but legal paperwork, helped manage the household. But Eleanor chafed against the restrictions. She was built for action, for work, for doing. Being still went against every instinct. I feel useless, she told Will one evening. You're growing our child. That's not useless. I'm lying in bed growing our child. There's a difference. Then lie in bed. I'll do the rest. March arrived with the promise of spring and Eleanor's due date looming. Dr. Collins estimated delivery in early to mid-March, though he cautioned that such estimates were inexact. The labor began on March 3rd at 3 in the morning. Eleanor woke to contractions that took her breath away. Will, sleeping lightly as he had for weeks, was instantly awake. It's time, Eleanor gasped. Will moved with focused efficiency, got Eleanor comfortable, sent Grace for Dr. Collins and the midwife Mrs. Henderson, who lived in town, built up the fire, heated water, laid out clean linens, did everything he could to prepare while terror gnawed at him. Collins arrived within 2 hours, Mrs. Henderson 30 minutes later. Both assessed Eleanor and exchanged glances that Will recognized as concern poorly hidden. How long do you estimate? Will asked Collins. Hard to say. First babies can take many hours. At Eleanor's age, complications are likely. We'll monitor closely. The labor stretched through morning into afternoon. Eleanor bore the pain with the same stoic determination she brought to all challenges, but Will could see her strength flagging. By hour 14 she was exhausted, sweat-soaked, barely able to focus. Collins examined her again, his expression darkening. The baby's not descending properly. If this continues much longer, I may need to intervene surgically. Is that safe? Will demanded. Nothing about this is safe, but waiting too long isn't safe either. The baby's showing signs of distress. Hour 16 brought the crisis to a head. The baby's heartbeat, which Collins monitored with an ear trumpet pressed to Eleanor's belly, grew irregular, weak. We're running out of time, Collins said. Eleanor, you need to push with everything you have. This is it. Eleanor, barely conscious from exhaustion, somehow found reserves she didn't know existed. Will held her hand, feeling bones grind under her grip. Mrs. Henderson coached her through contractions. Collins positioned himself to receive the baby. Push now, Collins commanded. Everything you have. Eleanor screamed a sound of pure effort and determination, once, twice, 3 times, and then impossibly miraculously the thin wail of a newborn filled the room. It's a boy, Collins announced, holding up a tiny, angry, perfect human being. He's small but breathing, good color, crying strong. But Eleanor had gone unconscious. Blood pooled beneath her, too much blood. Henderson, take the baby, Collins snapped. Will I need you outside? Now. I'm not leaving her. You're in the way. Let me work. Grace pulled Will from the room despite his protests. They stood in the hallway listening to Collins and Henderson work, hearing urgent voices and clinical terms. Will didn't understand. The baby cried in another room. Will's son, alive. But Eleanor might not be. 30 minutes felt like 30 years. Finally Collins emerged, exhausted, blood staining his sleeves. "She's stable," he said. "Lost a lot of blood. Touch and go for a while. But the bleeding stopped. She's strong, Will. Stronger than any woman her age should be. She's going to make it." Will sagged against the wall legs, suddenly unable to support him. And the baby? Small, 6 pounds even, but healthy. Henderson's cleaning him now. "You can meet your son." Will entered the room where Mrs. Henderson had taken the baby. She held a bundle wrapped in clean blankets, the infant's face barely visible within the folds. When she saw Will, she smiled. "He's perfect," she said, placing the baby in Will's arms. Will looked down at his son. Samuel. Tiny features, eyes closed, fists waving. A miniature miracle that shouldn't exist, but did. "Hello, Samuel," Will whispered. "I'm your father, and you have the strongest, bravest mother in the world." Eleanor woke 2 hours later, weak but alive. Will sat beside her bed, Samuel cradled in his arms. "Let me see him," Eleanor whispered. Will placed their son in her arms. Eleanor looked at the baby, tears streaming down her face, joy and exhaustion and wonder mixing in her expression. "We did it," she said. "God help me, we actually did it." "You did it. I just watched." "No. We survived Blackwood together, built this ranch together, faced every challenge together. We made this child together. Together is what matters." Samuel James Bennett. Born March 3, 1886, to a mother who was 55 and a father who was 31, against odds that should have been insurmountable. A child who represented possibility. Hope. The future built on foundation of past sorrows, transformed into present joy. Spring settled fully over the valley. April brought rain at last, ending the drought that had strangled the land for 3 years. The ranch bloomed. Wheat sprouted in neat rows. Grass grew thick and green. Cattle fattened. The windmill, now repaired, turned steadily, pumping water that flowed abundant. Samuel grew from tiny newborn to robust infant. Eleanor recovered slowly but completely, her strength returning week by week. Will hired additional help, unwilling to risk Eleanor's health by letting her work too hard too soon. Grace proved invaluable. She doted on Samuel with the fierce love of an older sister, walking him when he cried, singing songs Eleanor taught her, spending hours just watching him sleep. "He's going to be spoiled," Eleanor observed one afternoon. "Good," Grace replied. "Every child should be spoiled at least a little." The town's reaction to Samuel's birth was overwhelming. Even those who had criticized the marriage brought gifts: baby clothes, blankets, toys carved from wood, food to help the household during Eleanor's recovery. Adelaide Foster arrived with a beautifully crocheted blanket, her face showing genuine emotion. "Mrs. Bennett, I wanted you to know I was wrong about everything. You've shown this town what courage looks like, what love looks like. I'm ashamed I couldn't see it sooner." Eleanor accepted the blanket and the apology with grace. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Foster. What matters is learning from them." In June, the town held its annual harvest festival, delayed from fall because the previous year's harvest had been too poor to celebrate. Will and Eleanor attended. Samuel carried in Eleanor's arms Grace, walking proudly beside them. Will had prepared remarks. He stood before the assembled townspeople, his son in his arms, his wife beside him, and spoke words he'd been thinking about for months. "Many of you were present last year when I met my wife. Some of you laughed, some looked away, some judged. This woman was being sold on an auction block declared too old to be worth keeping, and I stood there and decided that some things are worth fighting for, worth standing up for, even when the cost is high." Eleanor Bennett taught this town something important: that age is not a measure of worth, that love has no expiration date, that courage can bloom at any moment in any person if they choose to act on principle rather than fear. She saved my ranch. She saved my life. She gave me a son I never thought I'd have again." He held up Samuel the baby blinking in the sunlight. "This child is proof that miracles happen when we stop judging and start seeing people for who they really are. When we choose courage over comfort. When we decide that human dignity matters more than social convention. Thank you all for being here today, for standing with us against Blackwood, for celebrating this harvest and this life with us." Applause filled the square, not scattered or polite but genuine and sustained. People who had once mocked now cheered. A town that had been divided now came together. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Will and Eleanor sat on their porch. Samuel slept in Eleanor's arms. Grace was inside preparing dinner. The ranch spread before them prosperous and peaceful. "Do you remember what I said that first day?" Will asked. "About seeing a survivor." "I remember. I was wrong. You're not just a survivor. You're a fighter, a builder, a mother, the woman who changed everything." Eleanor smiled. "You changed things too. You saw me when I was invisible. That made all the difference. We changed things together. Yes, together." Will's voice from the present, that 85-year-old man sitting by the fire in 1940, returned. His grandson Bobby leaned forward. His son Samuel wiped tears from his eyes. Grace had come from the kitchen to listen, her own face wet. "Your grandmother lived another 34 years after that day," Will said softly. "Samuel here grew up strong and smart just like her. They were the best years of my life. Not because they were easy, they weren't, but because we chose them, because we built them, because we refused to let the world tell us we didn't deserve happiness. That's the lesson, Bobby. When you go to war, when you face whatever comes next, remember this. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones fought with guns. They're the ones fought with courage, with principle, with the simple refusal to let cruelty win. Your grandmother was sold for 50 pounds of flour, but she taught a whole valley what human dignity means. And that lesson outlasted Silas Blackwood, outlasted the people who judged us, outlasted every voice that said we were wrong. She died in 1920. I've lived 20 more years without her, and every single day I'm grateful I was brave enough to step forward in that square and say, no more. That one choice gave me everything that mattered." Bobby stood, moved to his grandfather's chair, and embraced the old man. "Thank you for telling me, Grandpa. I'll remember." Samuel placed his hand on his father's shoulder. "I'm proud to be your son, proud to carry your name and mother's courage." Grace simply smiled, her eyes distant with memories of a frightened girl who found family when she needed it most. Outside, snow continued to fall on the Bennett Ranch. Inside, warmth and love and the weight of memory filled spaces where once there had been only grief. The story had been told, the lesson passed down, and in the telling it became immortal. Eleanor Bennett, sold at 55 on an auction block, had become legend, not because she was perfect, but because she was brave, because she survived, because she chose to bloom when everyone said her season was done. That was enough. That was everything. And her story, told by firelight on a winter night in 1940, would echo through the decades that followed, reminding anyone who heard it that it's never too late for courage, never too late for love, never too late for a second spring. The fire crackled, the family sat together, and somewhere in memory's mansion, Eleanor Bennett smiled, knowing that her life had mattered, that her choices had created ripples that would never stop spreading. That was her legacy, not the ranch, not the money, not even the son who bore witness to her courage. Her legacy was the lesson, the story, the proof that human dignity once claimed can never be taken away, and that lesson would live forever. Bobby stood straighter, his young shoulders squared as if already feeling the weight of the uniform he would wear. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "when I'm out there in the Pacific, when things get hard, I'll remember Grandma. I'll remember that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about standing up when it matters." Will reached out, placed his weathered hand on his grandson's shoulder. "That's all she would have asked, son. That's all any of us can ask." The fire crackled lower. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the ranch in white silence. But inside, 3 generations sat together, bound not just by blood, but by the story they carried. A story of dignity reclaimed, of love found in unlikely places, of a woman who refused to disappear. Eleanor Bennett's second spring had bloomed into a legacy that would never fade.